The man my wife left me for thought he owned the world. The only problem was, he had no idea I owned the company that paid for his corner office. My name is Nathan Whitaker. I'm 46 years old, born and raised in Connecticut, and for the last 23 years I've learned one lesson that never fails. The loudest person in the room is almost never the most powerful. People think success announces itself with private jets, magazine covers, and million-dollar watches. Real success doesn't need applause. It signs papers in quiet offices and lets everyone else chase the spotlight. I understood that long before my wife forgot it. The night my marriage officially ended began beneath crystal chandeliers hanging over one of Manhattan's most exclusive charity galas. Every table glittered with polished silver, expensive champagne, and people who measured each other by job titles instead of character. Claire always loved nights like these. She said ambition deserved an audience. I stood near the back of the ballroom, wearing the same tailored navy suit I'd owned for years. Nothing flashy. No designer logos stitched across the sleeve. Just a good suit worn by a man who had stopped trying to impress strangers a long time ago. Claire stood across the room in a black evening gown, smiling the smile that had once belonged only to me. It was brighter now, practiced, perfectly timed for photographers and executives. When she laughed, half the room looked in her direction. I remembered when that laugh echoed through our first apartment while we assembled cheap furniture from cardboard boxes. Back then, success meant paying rent on time. Somewhere along the way, that definition changed. Mine never did. Hers did. Nathan. Her voice floated across the ballroom before she reached me. Calm, polite, almost professional. I turned toward her and noticed she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was Preston Vale, billionaire executive. Financial magazines called him the architect of one of America's fastest-growing corporate empires. Television hosts described him as the future of modern business. Employees admired him. Investors trusted him. The room practically bent around his confidence. He extended his hand with the smile of a man accustomed to immediate respect. I've heard a lot about you, he said. Claire says you prefer staying out of the spotlight. His handshake was firm, rehearsed, calculated to establish dominance before the conversation even began. I smiled and shook his hand anyway. She's right, I answered. Someone has to enjoy the quiet. He chuckled politely. Claire didn't. Her eyes drifted around the ballroom, almost embarrassed that I had answered so simply. There was a time she admired that simplicity. Tonight it seemed to irritate her. A waiter passed carrying champagne. Glasses clinked softly while an orchestra played somewhere behind us. Everything looked beautiful. Everything felt cold. Preston slipped one hand into his pocket and glanced toward the stage where donors were being introduced. Claire tells me you've been comfortable letting her career take center stage. There was a pause just long enough for everyone nearby to hear. That takes confidence. I recognized the sentence for what it really was. Not a compliment. A measurement. Claire answered before I could. Nathan never cared much about corporate life. She smiled toward Preston instead of me. He likes simple things. Simple. Funny how one word can become an insult depending on who says it. I looked at Claire and saw someone I barely recognized. The woman who once celebrated every small victory with me now spoke as though stability were something to apologize for. The orchestra stopped. A spotlight illuminated the stage as the evening's host welcomed distinguished guests. Applause rolled across the ballroom like distant thunder. Preston leaned slightly closer to Claire, confident enough to forget I was still standing there. Ready? He asked softly. She nodded. Then she looked directly into my eyes. There wasn't anger there. There wasn't guilt either. Only certainty. Nathan, she said quietly, I think it's time we stop pretending this marriage still fits either of us. The words landed gently. Somehow that made them heavier. Around us, conversations continued. Glasses clinked. People laughed. Nobody noticed a marriage ending 10 feet away. From the dessert table, I held her gaze without blinking. Is that what you really want? I asked. She took one slow breath before answering. I deserve the life I've worked for. Then she reached for Preston's hand. He accepted it without hesitation. Several nearby executives smiled as though witnessing the beginning of an inspiring love story instead of the quiet collapse of 18 years. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't ask her to stay. I simply nodded once. Because while everyone in that ballroom believed they were watching a forgotten husband lose everything, only one person knew the truth. Monday morning, At exactly 8:30, Preston Vale would walk into the executive boardroom expecting another ordinary leadership meeting. And for the first time in his remarkable career, he would discover the name printed above his employment agreement was the same name belonging to the man whose wife he had just taken away. I walked out of the ballroom without looking back. The revolving doors turned slowly behind me, sealing the music and applause inside, while the cool Manhattan night wrapped around the street. Black sedans waited along the curb. Camera flashes still lit the entrance every few seconds as celebrities and executives arrived fashionably late. I stood there for a moment, slipped both hands into my coat pockets, and breathed the cold October air. It tasted cleaner than anything inside that ballroom. My phone vibrated before I reached the sidewalk. Claire. I watched her name appear on the screen until it disappeared. A second later, another message arrived. We should handle everything like adults. I smiled faintly. 18 years together, and now everything fit inside one sentence. Adults. I placed the phone back into my pocket without replying. Some conversations become unnecessary the moment the truth introduces itself. My driver pulled alongside the curb, but I waved him away. I wanted to walk. Manhattan always helped me think. The city never cared whether a man was celebrating or falling apart. Taxi horns echoed between buildings. Steam drifted from subway vents. Office windows still glowed 30 stories above the streets where thousands of strangers hurried home, carrying lives nobody else understood. Claire used to love walking those same sidewalks beside me. She would stop outside jewelry stores and laugh at watches neither of us could afford. We promised each other that if success ever arrived, we would never let money decide who we became. Funny how promises sound permanent until ambition starts negotiating with them. By the time I reached my apartment building, it was nearly 11. The doorman nodded politely as always. He never asked questions. That was one reason I had kept him employed for nearly 15 years. Loyalty deserves loyalty. Upstairs, the apartment felt exactly the way I had left it that morning. Quiet, organized, predictable. Claire had already moved most of her personal belongings weeks earlier under the excuse of renovating a condominium she claimed to be considering downtown. Looking back, every business trip, every late meeting, every unexplained weekend suddenly fit together like pieces of a puzzle that had been sitting face up all along. I poured a glass of water and stood in front of the living room windows overlooking the East River. Reflections from passing ferries shimmered across the dark water. Cities look peaceful from high enough above. Businesses do too. Most people only see polished buildings and quarterly earnings. They never see the difficult decisions made behind closed doors. They certainly never imagine those decisions resting on the shoulders of someone who deliberately avoids recognition. I opened a locked drawer beneath my desk and removed a slim black folder. Inside were documents that almost nobody outside my legal team had ever seen. Ownership structures, board resolutions, trust agreements, signatures, layers built over 2 decades to protect the company from unnecessary attention. Whitaker Capital Holdings appeared nowhere on television. We preferred results over publicity. Preston Vale had become famous because he managed one of our fastest-growing subsidiaries with remarkable confidence. He was talented, charismatic, excellent with investors. That was precisely why I hired him 6 years earlier after another firm nearly drove his career into the ground. I remembered our first meeting. He had thanked me for believing in him when others did not. Somewhere between success and magazine covers, gratitude had quietly transformed into arrogance. My secure phone rang. The display showed only one name. Margaret Ellis, chairwoman of the board. I answered immediately. Good evening, Margaret. She paused for a second. I assumed the gala was eventful. News traveled quickly among people responsible for protecting billion-dollar companies. You could say that. Should we prepare for Monday? She asked calmly. I looked again at the folder resting on my desk. Yes. Schedule the executive review for 8:30. Full attendance. She understood without requiring further explanation. Including Mr. Vale? Especially Mr. Vale. Silence lingered for a heartbeat before she answered. Very well. The board will be there. After the call ended, I closed the folder and returned it to the drawer. Revenge had never interested me. Accountability did. Businesses cannot survive if leaders forget that character matters as much as profit. Somewhere across the city, Claire probably believed she had stepped into a brighter future. Preston almost certainly believed he had won. I did not hate either of them. Hate clouds judgment, and judgment was exactly what Monday required. Before going to bed, I opened my calendar and reviewed the first meeting of the morning. Executive Governance Review. 8:30 sharp. Attendance mandatory. I made one small addition beneath the agenda. Personal appearance required. No virtual participation permitted. Then I shut the laptop, turned off the lights, and let the apartment fall into darkness. Outside, the city continued racing toward another sunrise. Inside, everything was still. For the first time in months, the silence did not feel lonely. It felt honest. Monday mornings always begin the same way in New York. Coffee carts fill the sidewalks before sunrise. Delivery trucks crowd loading docks. Security guards greet familiar faces without looking up from their desks. Routine has a comforting rhythm. It convinces people today will be no different from yesterday. At exactly 7:45, my car rolled beneath the private entrance of Whitaker Tower. The building carried no oversized logo. No glowing advertisements covered the glass. From the street, it looked like another understated financial headquarters surrounded by louder competitors. That was intentional. Quiet organizations tend to survive longer than noisy ones. My badge unlocked the executive entrance with a soft click. The security officer standing nearby straightened immediately. "Good morning, Mr. Whitaker." I smiled. "Morning, Daniel. How is your daughter enjoying college?" His face brightened. "She made the dean's list last week." "That is wonderful news. Tell her congratulations from me." Little conversations matter. Buildings are not held together by steel alone. They are held together by people who feel respected. I stepped into the private elevator and watched the city disappear beneath polished stainless steel doors. Floor numbers climbed silently until the elevator opened directly into the executive level. Margaret Ellis was already waiting outside the boardroom. She carried a thin binder beneath one arm and looked exactly as she had for the past 15 years. Calm, organized, impossible to surprise. "Everything is ready," she said. "All board members have arrived. Legal counsel is present. Internal audit is standing by if requested." I nodded once. "Has Preston checked in?" 5 minutes ago." She glanced toward the conference room. "He seems unusually confident." I almost laughed. Confidence often reaches its highest point a few moments before reality changes direction. Through the glass wall overlooking the city, I could see executives gathering around the long walnut table. Preston stood near the windows speaking with several division presidents. His posture was relaxed. His smile filled the room. He looked like a man expecting another successful quarter. Claire stood beside him wearing a cream business suit, visitor badge clipped neatly to her jacket. She had probably imagined this morning as the beginning of a glamorous new chapter. Their conversation paused when the assistant announced that the meeting would begin shortly. Preston adjusted his tie and accepted a cup of coffee from an aide without ever looking toward the entrance. He had no reason to. As far as he knew, the invisible owner of Whitaker Capital rarely attended operational reviews in person. That assumption had protected my privacy for years. Today it would become his greatest mistake. Margaret handed me a folder containing the final agenda. Executive Governance Review. Leadership Accountability. Strategic Restructuring. Ordinary words capable of changing extraordinary lives. Legal confirmed the employment agreements. I asked. "Every document has been verified twice," she answered, "including the original appointment signed 6 years ago." I closed the folder. Paper has a remarkable memory. It remembers every promise people forget they made. At 8:28, the board secretary opened the conference room doors. Conversations faded immediately. 12 directors took their seats. Preston remained standing at the head of the table where chief executive officers traditionally delivered quarterly remarks. Claire quietly settled into a guest chair along the side wall, looking pleased simply to be included. Preston cleared his throat and smiled across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate everyone attending on short notice. We have another outstanding quarter to discuss." He clicked a remote, projecting charts across the large presentation screen. Revenue growth, market expansion, investor confidence. Every slide celebrated success. Every statistic reflected thousands of employees whose hard work deserved recognition. I listened without interruption. Good leaders deserve the opportunity to present their work fairly before judgment begins. 20 minutes later, he finished to polite applause. "Before we conclude," Preston said confidently, I would also like to introduce someone very important to me. He looked toward Claire. Her support has meant more than she knows. Several executives smiled warmly. Claire stood, slightly embarrassed by the attention, yet clearly enjoying it. I watched without emotion. Personal relationships rarely concern a board of directors unless they begin influencing professional judgment. Margaret quietly leaned toward the secretary. The room grew still as she spoke into the microphone. Thank you, Mr. Vale. Before moving to the next agenda item, the board of directors requests the attendance of the executive chairman. Preston frowned slightly. I was not informed he would be joining us. Margaret answered with perfect composure. That is because the executive chairman chose to make the announcement personally. Every head in the room turned toward the entrance. The doors opened slowly. I stepped inside carrying nothing except a slim black folder. For one heartbeat, nobody moved. Then every board member rose to their feet at the same time. Good morning, Mr. Whitaker, they said almost in unison. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Preston remained frozen beside the presentation screen. The color slowly drained from his face as his eyes shifted from the standing directors to me, then back to the signature already visible on the first page inside the folder resting in my hand. Claire looked at the board, then at me, searching for an explanation that had arrived years too late. No one spoke. It was remarkable how quickly confidence disappeared when certainty was replaced with facts. The presentation screen still displayed Preston's smiling photograph beside impressive financial numbers, but nobody in the room was looking at it anymore. Every pair of eyes followed me as I walked toward the head of the table. My footsteps echoed softly across the polished floor, not because the room was large, but because silence amplifies everything. Preston remained standing, one hand still resting on the conference table. His confident smile had vanished, replaced by the cautious expression of a man searching for information that should have been impossible to miss. Claire looked from me to the board members who were still standing in respect. I watched realization begin to form behind her eyes, not all at once, but slowly, like dawn breaking over a city skyline. I reached my chair and placed the black folder carefully on the table before looking around the room. Please, I said calmly, have a seat. Every director sat immediately. Preston hesitated before lowering himself into his chair. Claire remained frozen for another second before quietly sitting beside the wall. Nobody looked comfortable anymore. Margaret slid a glass of water toward me. I thanked her with a small nod before opening the folder. The first document rested on top exactly where I expected it. Original Executive Appointment Agreement. Signed 6 years earlier. My signature appeared beside Preston's at the bottom of the page. I turned the document so everyone at the table could see it. Good morning, everyone, I began. Most of you know me well. Some of you know me only through quarterly reports and annual meetings. For our guests, allow me to introduce myself properly. I am Nathan Whitaker, founder and executive chairman of Whitaker Capital Holdings. The words were simple. The effect was not. Claire's shoulders stiffened. Preston stared at the signature as though seeing it for the first time. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. I continued before emotion could interrupt the facts. For more than 20 years, I have deliberately stayed away from media attention because companies should be recognized for their employees, not their owners. Public recognition is temporary. Strong institutions are built through consistency. Nobody interrupted. The room remained perfectly still. I turned another page. The organizational chart appeared on the large monitor as Margaret activated the presentation system. Whitaker Capital Holdings stood at the top. Beneath it branched dozens of companies operating across finance, technology, manufacturing, logistics, and commercial real estate. Several layers below appeared the familiar company logo Preston had spent years proudly representing. A thin blue line connected it directly back to the parent corporation. This, I said quietly, is the complete ownership structure. Claire leaned forward in her chair. Her eyes moved across the screen until they reached the company Preston managed. Then they continued upward. Higher. Higher still. Finally, they stopped beside the name Whitaker Capital Holdings. Beneath it appeared founder and executive chairman, Nathan Whitaker. She looked back at me, her expression no longer confused but stunned. Preston finally found his voice. Nathan, I did not know. His words sounded unusually small. No, I answered. You did not. He swallowed hard. Had I known, I raised one hand gently. You are missing the important point. Leadership is not measured by what people know about the owner. Leadership is measured by how people behave when they believe the owner is not watching. That sentence settled over the room heavier than any accusation could have. Several directors exchanged quiet glances. Nobody argued because nobody needed to. Facts rarely require dramatic speeches. I folded my hands together. Your financial performance has been outstanding. Revenue exceeded projections. Market expansion surpassed expectations. Those achievements deserve recognition. Preston looked relieved for the briefest moment. Then I continued. However, financial success never exempts leadership from ethical standards. The relief disappeared immediately. Margaret distributed sealed envelopes to every board member. Legal counsel opened his notebook. Internal audit representatives quietly prepared their files. Everything had been organized before anyone entered the room. There would be no emotional debate, only documentation. Claire finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan, why did you never tell me? I looked at her for a long moment before answering honestly. Because when we married, you once told me you loved the man I was, not the balance sheet attached to my name. I believed you. I wanted at least one place in my life where I could simply be Nathan. My voice never rose. It did not need to. Some truths carry enough weight all by themselves. Claire lowered her eyes toward the table. Across from her, Preston remained completely silent, staring at the signature that had quietly shaped his entire career long before he ever imagined standing across from the man who had written it. The legal counsel adjusted his glasses and broke the seal on the first envelope with practiced precision. Thick documents slid onto the conference table one page at a time. Nobody rushed. Serious decisions deserved deliberate movements. I had learned that from my father years before I ever signed my first business contract. If a decision changes someone's future, you owe that person your patience, even when the facts are already clear. I folded my hands and looked directly at Preston. Before we continue, I want something to be understood by everyone in this room. This meeting is not about personal disappointment. It is about corporate responsibility. The company succeeds only when trust exists from the boardroom to the front door. Preston nodded slowly, though his eyes remained fixed on the documents spread before him. The confidence that had defined him only 30 minutes earlier had quietly disappeared. He was no longer looking at numbers on a presentation screen. He was looking at records with legal consequences. Margaret opened another folder and placed several printed emails beside the employment agreement. Over the past 6 weeks, she said calmly, the governance committee initiated a routine review after receiving reports concerning potential conflicts of interest involving executive decision-making. Preston immediately looked up. Routine review. Margaret answered without emotion. Every senior executive is subject to the same standard. I appreciated her choice of words. Nobody was being singled out because of personal relationships. The process existed long before this morning. The board simply followed it wherever the evidence led. Legal counsel continued. The committee found no indication of financial fraud, accounting irregularities, or misuse of company funds. I noticed several directors relax slightly. Those were serious allegations, and I was relieved they were not supported by the facts. Preston had built value for shareholders. That truth deserved acknowledgement. Then the attorney turned another page. However, the investigation identified multiple violations of executive ethics policies regarding disclosure obligations and conduct that may reasonably create conflicts affecting leadership judgment and corporate reputation. The room became still again. Corporate reputation is an invisible asset, difficult to measure, even harder to rebuild once damaged. Preston leaned forward carefully. If this concerns my personal relationship, I would like to clarify that it has never influenced my business decisions. His voice remained respectful, though noticeably quieter than before. I believed he was speaking honestly as he understood the situation. Unfortunately, intentions and obligations are not always the same thing. I answered before anyone else could. This is not a courtroom, Preston. Nobody is accusing you of making dishonest financial decisions. The issue before us is whether executive policies requiring disclosure were followed. He closed his eyes briefly before responding. No, they were not. It was the first completely unguarded sentence he had spoken all morning. There was no excuse attached to it. No attempt to shift responsibility. Only acceptance. One of the independent directors looked toward him. May we ask why? Preston released a slow breath. Because I believed my personal life belonged outside the office. I convinced myself it would not matter. The director nodded thoughtfully. And now? Preston looked around the table before answering. Now I understand perception matters as much as intention when people trust you to lead. Nobody interrupted. Honest reflection carries its own weight. Claire remained silent beside the wall, her hands resting tightly together in her lap. The confident woman from the gala seemed to have vanished overnight. She watched the conversation unfold with growing realization that this room operated differently from the glamorous events she admired. Nobody shouted. Nobody humiliated anyone. Every conclusion came from documented facts rather than emotional reactions. She finally looked toward me. Nathan, did you know before the gala? I met her eyes. Yes. Her expression tightened. For how long? Long enough to separate my responsibilities as your husband from my responsibilities as executive chairman. She lowered her head, absorbing the answer in silence. The truth was not satisfying. It was simply necessary. Margaret activated another slide showing the company's code of executive conduct. Several paragraphs appeared on the screen, highlighted. In blue, disclosure requirements, leadership accountability, preservation of organizational trust, policies that every executive had signed upon accepting promotion. Preston slowly reached for the copy resting in front of him. His signature appeared on the final page beneath mine. He stared at it for several seconds before quietly closing the folder. I remember signing this, he said. I just never imagined I would be sitting here because of it. I gave a small nod. Most leaders never imagine difficult days while everything is going well. That is precisely why principles must exist before they are needed. Morning sunlight stretched farther across the conference table, reflecting softly against the glass walls overlooking Manhattan. Outside, thousands of employees continued building another successful business day, completely unaware that the future of one executive was being decided not by anger, jealousy, or revenge, but by the same standards every leader had promised to uphold long before this meeting ever began. The chairman of the governance committee slowly closed his binder and looked around the conference table before speaking. The committee has completed its review. The findings are clear. The remaining question before the board is not whether policies were violated. They were. The question is how this organization chooses to respond. His voice was steady, measured, and completely free of emotion. That was how important decisions were supposed to sound. One by one, the directors reviewed the documents in front of them. No whispers filled the room. No hurried conversations broke the silence. The only sounds came from pages turning and pens making careful notes in the margins. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan continued moving without pause. Yellow taxis crossed intersections. Construction cranes swung slowly above neighboring buildings. Somewhere below, people hurried toward meetings that probably felt important to them. Up here, time seemed to move differently. Preston finally looked directly at me. Nathan, before this goes any further, I owe you something. His voice carried none of the confidence I had heard at the gala. When we first met 6 years ago, you gave me an opportunity after everyone else had written me off. You trusted my judgment. You trusted my leadership. Somewhere along the way, I started believing the headlines instead of remembering who opened the door. He stopped speaking for a moment and lowered his eyes toward the polished table. That failure belongs to me. I studied him quietly before answering. Success has a strange way of changing mirrors. At first, you look into one to measure your progress. Eventually, if you are not careful, you begin looking into it to admire yourself. A few directors nodded almost imperceptibly. It was not a lesson reserved for Preston alone. Every leader in the room understood how easily confidence could become pride. Claire remained silent until she finally spoke with a voice that sounded smaller than I had ever heard before. I thought I understood your world. She looked at me instead of anyone else. I thought you were hiding your ambition because you lacked it. I never imagined you were protecting something much bigger than yourself. I answered gently. I was protecting normal life. She blinked, confused. Normal life? I nodded once. I wanted dinners where nobody asked about stock prices. Weekends where we could walk through Central Park without photographers. Holidays where family mattered more than business magazines. I spent years building enough success so we could live quietly. Somewhere along the way, quiet stopped being enough for you. She lowered her head without responding. There was nothing left to argue. Some distances appear gradually, until one day they become impossible to cross. Margaret carefully slid another document toward each director. The Governance Committee recommends immediate removal from the position of Chief Executive Officer pending completion of executive transition procedures. The recommendation includes continuation of contractual compensation consistent with the employment agreement and full cooperation during leadership succession. Preston looked down at the recommendation and released a slow breath. No public accusation, he asked. Legal counsel answered before anyone else. There is no evidence supporting misconduct requiring public disciplinary action beyond the governance findings. The company has no interest in damaging reputations unnecessarily. The objective is institutional integrity, not humiliation. I appreciated those words. Too many organizations confuse accountability with spectacle. They are not the same thing. Preston slowly closed the folder in front of him. Then I will not contest the recommendation. Several directors looked up, slightly surprised by how quickly he accepted the outcome. He continued before anyone could misunderstand. I signed those policies. I benefited from this company. If I ask employees to accept responsibility for their decisions, I cannot refuse responsibility for mine. For the first time that morning, I saw the executive I had hired years earlier. Not the celebrity from magazine covers. Not the confident speaker from investor conferences. Simply a professional accepting the consequences of his own choices. The chairman looked around the room. All those in favor. 12 hands rose almost together. No celebration followed. No satisfaction filled the room. Votes like these never feel like victories. They feel like necessary endings. The chairman lowered his hand. The motion carries unanimously. Preston quietly removed the identification badge from his jacket and placed it beside the folder. Such a small object. Plastic, metal, and a photograph. Yet sometimes the smallest things carry the greatest meaning. He stood slowly and looked toward me one final time. Thank you for believing in me once. I stood as well. I did not stop believing in your talent, Preston. I stopped trusting your judgment. Those words remained suspended in the silence between us. Talent can build remarkable careers. Character determines whether those careers endure. Without another word, Preston gathered nothing except his notebook and walked calmly toward the conference room doors. Nobody applauded his departure. Nobody looked away either. Every person present understood they had just witnessed something far more valuable than the fall of an executive. They had witnessed the cost of forgetting that leadership begins long before titles and continues long after they are gone. The conference room remained quiet for several seconds after the door closed behind Preston. Nobody hurried to fill the silence. In business, as in life, endings deserve a moment of respect before new beginnings begin. I looked around the table at 12 experienced directors who had spent decades making difficult decisions. None of them looked satisfied. That told me I had chosen the right people to help guide the company. People who celebrate another person's downfall rarely make wise leaders. Margaret carefully gathered the completed voting documents and handed them to legal counsel for filing. The governance matter is officially concluded, she said. The remaining agenda concerns executive continuity. Her voice returned to its usual business-like rhythm. The company still had nearly 40,000 employees depending on the decisions made in this room. Personal disappointment could not be allowed to interrupt their future. I stood and walked toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. Morning sunlight reflected off neighboring skyscrapers, turning the glass into ribbons of gold stretching across the skyline. I remembered standing in this very room more than 20 years earlier when Whitaker Capital occupied only 2 rented offices and employed 12 people. Back then I promised myself one thing. If the company ever became successful, nobody working here would lose sleep wondering whether leadership could be trusted. Profit was important. Trust was essential. Without turning around, I spoke quietly. Who was prepared to recommend an interim chief executive officer? Several directors exchanged thoughtful glances before Margaret answered. The committee unanimously recommends Daniel Mercer. I smiled slightly. Daniel had joined the company straight out of graduate school almost 18 years earlier. He rarely appeared in financial magazines because he spent his time solving problems instead of chasing attention. Bring him upstairs, I said. 20 minutes later, the conference room doors opened again. Daniel stepped inside wearing a simple gray suit, carrying a notebook already filled with handwritten notes. His expression suggested he had no idea why he had been called into the executive boardroom. "Good morning," he said carefully. "You asked to see me?" I motioned toward the empty chair Preston had occupied only minutes before. "Please sit down." Daniel looked uncertain, but obeyed. Margaret slid a folder toward him. "The board has appointed you interim chief executive officer effective immediately, pending formal confirmation next quarter." He blinked twice before looking around the room. There must be some mistake. I almost laughed. That answer alone told me the board had chosen wisely. The people most qualified for leadership are often the last ones to believe they deserve it. "There is no mistake," I answered. "The board believes you understand something that cannot be taught." Daniel looked genuinely confused. "What is that?" I folded my hands on the table. "That leadership is never about becoming the most important person in the room. It is about making everyone else feel their work matters." His eyes lowered toward the appointment documents. "I will do everything I can to earn that trust." "Do not earn mine," I replied. "Earn theirs." I nodded toward the directors. "And after that, earn the trust of every employee whose name will never appear in an annual report." Daniel signed the acceptance letter with a steady hand. There was no applause. Promotions should inspire responsibility before celebration. As the meeting concluded, directors quietly collected their materials and departed one by one. Each wished me a good day before leaving the room. Soon only Margaret, Claire, and I remained. The silence between Claire and me felt different now. It was no longer filled with anger or confusion. It carried the weight of two people finally seeing the same truth from opposite sides. She stood slowly and walked toward the windows where I remained, overlooking the city. "I spent years believing I married a man who lacked ambition," she said softly. "Now I realize I married a man who never needed to prove anything." I kept my eyes on the skyline. "There is a difference." She nodded. "I see that now." Her voice trembled slightly before becoming steady again. "I kept chasing people who looked powerful. I stopped noticing the man who actually was." I turned toward her for the first time since the board meeting had ended. The expensive conference room, the skyline, the polished table, none of it mattered in that moment. We were simply two people standing among the consequences of countless small choices made over many years. "Claire," I said gently, "people rarely lose a marriage in one dramatic moment. They lose it one quiet decision at a time until one day there is nothing left to protect." She closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, they were filled not with excuses, but with understanding. Sometimes understanding arrives far too late to change the ending, but it can still explain how the story reached it. Claire stood beside the window for another few seconds before quietly picking up her purse. The confidence that had surrounded her at the charity gala had disappeared completely. She looked around the executive boardroom as though seeing it for the first time. The polished walnut table, the framed photographs of groundbreaking ceremonies, the shelves filled with awards from organizations that valued integrity more than publicity. None of it had ever been hidden from her. She had simply never asked the questions that would have revealed the truth. "I should go," she said softly. I nodded. "Take care of yourself, Claire." She looked at me as if expecting something more. Perhaps anger. Perhaps an accusation. Maybe even one last attempt to change what had already happened. Instead, she found only calm. After a long pause, she turned and walked toward the door. Just before leaving, she stopped without looking back. "I really did love you once." Her voice was barely louder than a whisper. I answered honestly, "I know." Then she walked away. The door closed gently behind her. No dramatic goodbye. No final argument. Just the quiet sound of one chapter ending. Margaret remained beside the conference table, organizing the last of the documents. After a moment, she looked toward me. "Would you like me to cancel your afternoon meetings?" I smiled faintly. "No. The company still has work to do." She returned the smile. "That is exactly what I expected you to say." Within minutes, the executive floor returned to its normal rhythm. Assistants answered phones. Analysts carried reports between offices. Managers discussed quarterly forecasts in the hallway. Business has a remarkable ability to continue moving regardless of what happens in one room. That continuity was one of the reasons I loved building organizations. Companies become larger than the people who create them. They survive because thousands of ordinary individuals keep showing up every morning to do extraordinary work. Around noon, I decided to leave the office for lunch. I preferred walking several blocks to a small family-owned restaurant that had served the same homemade soup for nearly 20 years. The owner greeted me by name before pointing toward my usual table near the front window. "Good to see you again, Nathan." "Good to see you too, Frank." He poured coffee without asking because he already knew my order. Relationships built over time rarely require many words. While I waited for lunch, my phone vibrated once. A message from Daniel Mercer. "Thank you for believing in me. I will not let the company down." I replied with only one sentence. "Let people well. The rest will follow." Sometimes advice becomes more valuable when it is short enough to remember during difficult moments. As I placed the phone back on the table, another message appeared. This one came from an unfamiliar number. "Nathan, it is Preston. I wanted to thank you for the dignity you show me today. Most companies would have turned the meeting into a public spectacle. You did not. I understand now that I spent years trying to become an important executive when I should have focused on becoming a better leader." I read the message twice before setting the phone aside. There was no request for another chance. No attempt to defend himself. Just accountability. That alone separated him from many executives I had met over the years. I typed a brief response. "Learn from this. That is all any of us can do." Frank arrived carrying a bowl of soup and a warm loaf of bread. "Everything all right?" he asked casually. I looked out the window where people hurried through another busy Manhattan afternoon. "It will be." He nodded as though that answer made perfect sense. Maybe it did. The best conversations often happen between people who know when not to ask unnecessary questions. Later that afternoon, I stopped by several departments before returning to my office. Employees smiled politely, completely unaware of everything that had happened upstairs. They spoke about client meetings, software upgrades, and upcoming deadlines. One young analyst proudly showed me a proposal she had worked on all weekend. Another employee introduced me to his newborn daughter's photograph. Life continued exactly as it should. Walking through those offices reminded me why I had hidden my ownership for so many years. I never wanted people working harder because the founder happened to be watching. I wanted them to believe their work mattered even when nobody important seemed to notice. Because the truth was simple. Someone always noticed. Leadership is rarely about standing on a stage. More often it is about quietly walking through ordinary hallways, shaking hands, remembering names, and making certain every person understands they are building something worth believing in. As evening sunlight settled across the city, I stood once again beside the office windows overlooking Manhattan. The skyline had not changed since that morning. The only thing that had changed was the clarity with which I saw my own future. Some doors close because they must. Others close, so better ones finally have room to open. 3 months passed more quickly than I expected. Winter slowly surrendered to spring, and Manhattan exchanged gray skies for mornings filled with clear sunlight reflecting across the Hudson River. Whitaker Capital continued moving forward with the quiet confidence that had defined it for decades. Daniel Mercer proved exactly why the board had trusted him. Employee satisfaction increased. Client retention reached record levels. Instead of filling conference stages with promises, he spent his time visiting regional offices, listening more than speaking. Leadership had found the right hands. One Friday afternoon, Margaret walked into my office carrying the quarterly performance report. She placed it on my desk with a smile that required no explanation. "The board voted unanimously this morning," she said. "Daniel has officially accepted the permanent appointment." I looked out the window toward the skyline before answering. "He earned it." She nodded. "He says he learned the most important lesson of his career from watching what happened that Monday." I smiled faintly. "I hope it was not the board meeting." Margaret laughed softly. "No. He said it was watching you separate personal pain from professional responsibility." After she left, I remained by the window for several minutes thinking about those words. Life rarely gives us the chance to choose what happens to us. It almost always gives us the opportunity to choose how we respond. That choice defines far more than success ever will. My phone buzzed once. The message came from an attorney handling the final paperwork for my divorce. Everything had been completed without conflict. No unnecessary disputes. No public attention. Claire requested only the belongings she had personally purchased before our marriage. She asked for nothing connected to Whitaker Capital. I signed the final document electronically and closed the file. 20 years together had officially become a matter of legal record rather than daily life. There was sadness in that truth, but there was also peace. Some endings deserve grief. They do not deserve bitterness. A few weeks later, I attended a charity fundraiser hosted by a children's education foundation. Unlike the gala months earlier, this event felt refreshingly ordinary. Teachers spoke about scholarship programs. Volunteers shared stories about mentoring students. Nobody cared who owned what company. They cared whether children would have better opportunities tomorrow than they had yesterday. As I walked toward the exit at the end of the evening, I heard someone call my name. I turned and saw Claire standing near the entrance. She looked different, not because of her clothes or appearance, but because the constant urgency that had once surrounded her was gone. She walked over slowly and offered a small, sincere smile. "Congratulations," she said. "I read about Daniel's appointment. The company seems stronger than ever." "Thank you," I answered. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she looked toward the city lights stretching beyond the ballroom windows. I spent so many years chasing what looked impressive that I forgot to appreciate what was meaningful. There was no expectation in her voice, no request, just quiet honesty. "I have been volunteering with a literacy program on weekends," she continued. "It turns out helping children learn to read is more satisfying than attending executive parties." I smiled. "I'm glad you found something that matters." She nodded. "I hope you found peace." I looked across the room where volunteers were stacking chairs and cleaning tables after everyone else had gone home. "I think peace was never missing," I said. "I just had to stop looking for it in the wrong place." She understood. I could see it in her eyes. We wished each other well and walked in opposite directions without regret. Outside, spring air carried the sounds of the city through the evening streets. I chose to walk home instead of calling for my driver. The sidewalks were busy with couples, families, and young professionals beginning another weekend. Nobody recognized me. Nobody stopped to ask about board meetings, investments, or headlines. I was simply another man enjoying a quiet evening in New York. That anonymity felt like a gift. As I crossed the park, I remembered something my father once told me while we repaired an old wooden fence behind our family home. He said, "Son, people spend their whole lives trying to look important. The happiest ones spend their lives trying to be useful." I did not fully understand those words when I was young. I understood them completely now. Looking back, I never lost my marriage because another man had more money or a bigger title. I almost lost myself by believing I needed to prove my worth to people who measured life with the wrong ruler. Real wealth was never hidden inside skyscrapers, luxury cars, or magazine covers. It lived in quiet mornings, trusted friendships, meaningful work, and the ability to look in the mirror without apologizing to the person staring back. The city lights shimmered across the river as I continued walking beneath the evening sky, grateful not for everything I had built, but for everything I had finally learned.